On February 9, 2021, Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, made a rare public reference to China and Russia for influencing Canadian public policy and the electoral process in various ways to undermine the democratic system. 7 months later, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a federal election will be held on September 20th. Trudeau would have served until 2023, however called the election early. It is widely believed he called the election 2 years early in order to gain a majority government as soon as possible, leveraging the current administration's accomplishments in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think what we see is a very clear contrast between all the different parties on how we need to move forward as a country. And this is a time when Canadians should get to be very clear about how they want to end this pandemic, how they want to build back better for the future. Because whichever government they elect is going to be making decisions in the coming months, not a year from now, not 2 years from now, but now, but how we move forward. And that is what Canadians get to decide.
The leaders of Canada's major political parties held their final English language election debate 11 days before voting day. One of the highlights of the debate was an item devoted to China, human rights, and the economy, which was unprecedented. Relations between China and Canada deteriorated after Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, was arrested in Canada in late 2018. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, immediately arrested 2 Canadian citizens in China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who have not yet been released. In the debate on September 9th, the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh spoke first. He proposed that we have to do everything possible to secure the release of these 2 Canadians. We need to work with our allies to apply pressure and make sure that we return these Canadians home. Liberal Party leader Justin Trudeau rushed to respond by saying, "That's exactly what we've been doing over the past 3 years. We have worked with international allies to put pressure on China in every single one of their meetings." Trudeau has also repeatedly stressed that Canada's voice is loud and clear in getting the CCP to follow the rules. He said, "We've worked closely with the US. We at the G7 a few weeks ago worked with the international community to make sure we're moving forward on challenging China where necessary in human rights. We are competing with them economically where we need to and holding them to account on the rule of law as a global community. Canada's voice has been very strong on that." Conservative leader O'Toole refuted by saying, "Canada's voice has been absent. We have not worked with our allies on Huawei. We have not stood up for the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. We've not fought for the 2 Michaels and put pressure on the communist regime. We have not stood up for human rights. You did not show up for a vote declaring genocide towards the Uyghur people. You didn't show up." Radio Free Asia reports that the federal election poll shows that most Canadians would like to see the new government take a tougher stance on China. However, the incumbent Liberal Party has only mentioned China once in its election platform as part of its policy of dealing with unacceptable behavior from authoritarian regimes. The Conservative Party, Canada's opposition party, has a strong focus on preventing the CCP's infiltration into Canada. Their campaign platform includes no longer prioritizing trade with China, treating China's persecution of Uyghurs as genocide, targeting China's foreign influence operations in Canada, banning Huawei from the construction of Canada's 5G network, sanctioning China's most serious human rights offenders, withdrawing Canada from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank championed by the CCP, and support Hong Kong protesters. On Taiwan, the Conservatives advocate greater political cooperation with Taiwan and to change Canada's diplomatic representative offices in Taiwan. O'Toole is clearly inclined to adopt new tactics to deal with the CCP.
All Canadians are thinking of Michael Spavor and his family. This is horrific news, and it's completely unacceptable. The Communist regime in China is using one of our citizens as a diplomatic ploy, and it's unacceptable. And we need to stand up clearly and have our allies stand up against this type of conduct by Communist China. Canada is a smaller nation in population and economic size, but we're a giant when it comes to our values, and we will stand up. Mr. Trudeau has been offside with respect to China for 6 years. A Conservative government will stand up for our values, our citizens, and our security.
Beijing is closely watching the Canadian federal election. On September 14th, the Globe and Mail reported that during the Liberal government's first year in office, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Canadian publisher reached an agreement with the Communist Party-owned publisher to publish Trudeau's memoir, Common Ground, under a new title, The Legend Continues, in China. According to the article, the title of the Chinese version alludes to the fact that Trudeau followed in the footsteps of his father, Pierre Trudeau, who first established relations with Communist China. Yilin Press of Nanjing, the Chinese publisher of Trudeau's book, is owned by Jiangsu Phoenix Publishing and Media, a state-owned enterprise that takes its orders from the Communist Party's provincial propaganda department of Jiangsu. In a marketing release, the Chinese publisher said that Trudeau, early in his first term as Prime Minister, brought Canada into the Beijing-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This move was carried out in the face of U.S. opposition. The book's release in China came as Chinese billionaires were donating to Trudeau's father's foundation. Businessmen with ties to Beijing were spending money to support a liberal cash drive attended by Trudeau, including Zhang Bin, who was an advisor to Beijing and a prominent foreign propaganda figure for Beijing. Beijing has also taken action against political figures they don't like. In Vancouver, 2 Chinese candidates who were the most vocal critics of human rights abuses by Chinese authorities have been targeted. Canadian publisher Glacier Media reports that Vancouver residents who support the CCP take to social media platforms such as WeChat to appeal for votes for the Liberal Party and smear Conservative Member of Parliament Kenny Zhao. The report quotes the WeChat messages saying, "Please vote Liberal and use your power in the Chinese community so we can have a chance to influence Canada's future." Zhao introduced the bill C-282, an act to establish the Foreign Influence Registry, in spring 2021. It was passed by Parliament on first reading. However, because of Trudeau's sudden launch of the federal election, the bill is likely to be scrapped, just like other bills that do not complete the legislative process. Another longtime NDP Member of Parliament, Jenny Kwan, has a constituency that happens to be in part of Vancouver's Chinatown. However, one of Vancouver's so-called Chinatown community leaders has implicitly criticized her stance on China and recently used free lunches to canvass for Kwan's opponent, the Liberal Party candidate. It has been revealed multiple times in Vancouver that people in the Chinese community are allegedly buying votes for pro-CCP candidates, such as offering free meals and providing transportation subsidies for voters. On May 20th, 2021, veteran investigative journalist Sam Cooper said at the launch of his new book, Willful Blindness: How a Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West, that he was attacked by pro-communist groups. The attacks came after his article in 2020 revealed that the CCP had urgently called on the Chinese community in Canada to send large quantities of masks and other protective products back to China through the United Front system. These people took to WeChat to call for a crowdfunding campaign to sue Cooper. Surprisingly, the WeChat posting also appeared on the website of a federal MP's office. Charles Burton, a former Canadian diplomat in China who attended the book launch, said that some Canadians are being manipulated out of their naivety or greed. The CCP seems confident that Canadians who have gotten on the CCP gravy train will continue to lobby the Canadian government quietly and successfully. Currently, Canada has no legislation related to foreign agents, and he hopes the book, Willful Blindness, will be a wake-up call to Canadians.
I think the main willful blindness is to the nature of the PRC regime. You know, there's a desire to pretend that Chinese communist institutions are equivalent to Canadian institutions, whereas really the PRC regime is an integrated party, state, military, security, industrial complex.
On May 31st, 2021, Alliance Canada Hong Kong, ACHK, presented its investigative report. in plain sight, Beijing's unrestricted network of foreign influence in Canada to the Canadian Parliament. The ACHK report reveals how the United Front Work Department of the CCP has been conducting extensive work in Canada. Through social media, so-called civic organizations, cooperative relations with universities, colleges, and other units, proxies, and covert organizations, etc., it coerces and engages with Canadians of Chinese descent and people in the political, business, and academic circles to do its bidding. The report also cites Chinese partnerships with Canadian academic research institutions to promote Beijing and acquire intellectual property. Some Canadian university partners even include China's military units. The report says, the Chinese side has worked hard to blur the line between military and civilian research. In late May, the Alberta government asked 4 major universities to suspend their cooperation with individuals or organizations associated with Beijing or the CCP, citing national security concerns and fear of research being used to abuse human rights. Previously, the University of Alberta had extensive research collaborations with the Chinese and shared and transferred its own research affecting strategically significant academic expertise such as nanotechnology, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. Canadian intelligence security experts have long warned that China will steal important Canadian strategic technology through cooperation with Canadian universities, posing a serious threat to the country. New Brunswick terminates its partnership with the Confucius Institute after the contract expires in 2022. In June, the province's Education Minister, Dominic Carty, revealed at a hearing of the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on Canada-China Relations that the decision to disband the Confucius Institute was met with pressure from the CCP Consul General, who threatened economic retaliation by the sale of Canadian lobster to China. Carty described the Confucius Institute's overtly political propaganda in the form of cultural and linguistic references, including having elementary school students draw maps of China to eliminate the border between the mainland and Taiwan, denying the facts about the Tiananmen Square massacre, and disciplining students who question China's poor human rights record. These are all things that happen in Canadian schools, Carty said. So when he became director at the end of 2018, he decided to address the Confucius Institute, which led to a series of interesting lobbies. He said the first person to lobby him was former New Brunswick Premier Sean Graham, who wanted Carty to maintain operations with Chinese schools, Chinese people, and Confucius Institutes in the province in order to keep New Brunswick schools operating in China. Later, the Chinese Consul General in Canada also visited his office. The Consul General made it clear that this incident would threaten the sale of Canadian lobster in China. In addition to this threat, the Chinese Consul General invited Carty to visit China and said that the way to address his concerns was to visit China. Despite the closure of some Confucius Institutes, many provincial school boards and colleges and universities in Canada continue to work with them. However, for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the presence of Chinese academies in Canada does not concern him because he is not even concerned about the Chinese military. In mid-December 2020, Canadian independent media, Rebel Media, obtained a government-redacted document that showed the Trudeau government was training Chinese commanders at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto and other military facilities in Kingston. The Chinese military participants included 1- and 2-star generals and an entire task force that would learn Canadian cold-weather military tactics. The documents also show that the then U.S. government objected to Canada's decision to train Chinese communist soldiers, but Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ignored it, claiming that it was only the Trump administration that objected and that the other Five Eyes coalition countries did not express concern. Government documents obtained by the Canadian media from the Freedom of Information Act showed that the Canadian Department of National Defence cancelled about 10 cooperation activities with the Chinese Communist military in 2019. These include winter military exercises between the two countries, assistance in training Chinese military personnel for polar training, and training for UN peacekeeping missions. In Canadian federal elections, foreign policy is usually a third-tier priority in party platforms, and election debates rarely plays a decisive role in the outcome of an election. However, it seems different this time. Regardless of the election outcome, the issue of the CCP will carry a much heavier weight in the minds of Canadians than it did in the past.